Welcome. Thank you for joining us at the C.I.A. Services Association's In Practice series. Today we're going to talk about the SuperBudget and the concepts behind the SuperBudget. About 25 years ago, C.I.A. Services created this SuperBudget model that we use for all of our clients. There are some key concepts in it that we're going to go over today that'll help you understand how all the pieces fit together and how it creates a great model, a great planning tool for your business now and into the future. Before we get into what's in the SuperBudget model and what's special about it, let's think about the two main questions that every single board member ought to be able to answer very easily if asked. And to do that, picture yourself at an annual meeting. So you've gone through all of your highlights for the year, you've done your election, and we move into the open forum section. And a homeowner raises their hands and says, what is the right assessment for our community? Or how much money should we have in the bank? If you've been on the board more than a few minutes, you know they would never ask it exactly like that. It would be more like, why is our assessment so high? Or we have too much money, refund it back to us. In any case, the question comes up, and if you're the president, how do you answer that? Well, the president, it's very easy. The president says, Ms. Treasurer, would you answer that? And the treasurer, again, it can be easy for them, the treasurer will say, Mr. Community Manager, will you answer that? In other words, it's not an easy question to answer. Sometimes they'll be stumbling, well, we need to have enough in the bank to handle when the clubhouse burns down and enough for a rainy day. There's a lot of stumbling, but answering that question is really very simple if you have the benefit of a SuperBudget, which looks at the full responsibility of the association from a financial standpoint. So let's start with what is a SuperBudget? What is the SuperBudgeting process? Well, first off, it's a comprehensive long-term and short-term look at the financial needs and obligations of the association. It's not just what's happening next year, it's the full obligations that an association has. One thing that's very unique about the SuperBudget is the fact that it has an integrated reserve study. We'll go ahead and talk about that in just a minute, but that's a very key portion. When you're done, you have a very good package that is put together which documents the whole budget, all the assumptions, and future forecasts. It's a pretty thick package, as you might see right here, of information. And finally, if you're doing SuperBudgeting well, then you're going to avoid surprises from a financial standpoint. You're going to avoid erratic changes in your assessments or the need for a special assessment. So that's what a SuperBudget process is. And why have we done this? Why have we created a SuperBudget model as opposed to just doing the traditional budgeting, which is to figure out how many homes we have times the assessment, that's our revenues. How much are we going to spend on insurance, taxes, grounds maintenance, pools, and things like that for just next year? The need for a SuperBudget comes from this. There is no way, it's impossible to determine what the right assessment is for the association if you're not looking at the full financial picture, the requirements for all of your assets. How much money do you have to put aside for resurfacing the pool, for putting a new roof on the clubhouse, for resurfacing streets, for replacing gates, and all of those things? If you're not looking at those long-term expenditures, it's impossible to set the right assessment. And there's a whole industry of professionals out there who do what's called reserve analysis. They do a really great job at it, and their good work will cost $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. And so the problem is that many board members don't necessarily appreciate the need for a reserve analysis and may not vote to expend the funds to pay for that. Realizing that many, many years ago, our company developed this super budget model. The key point of it, integrates into the model that reserve analysis. And so we're getting all the things that an association needs to do a full financial picture in the super budget. Before I move on, the question would come, well, are you saying we don't need to ever do an outside analysis, hire a professional to do it? Because you're our management company, you're doing it. Well, think about it this way, that getting an outside review, first of all, if you have a very large community with lots and lots of assets, or you have a complex community with unique assets, it really is good to get a professional who does this to evaluate your assets. Or if you have a big or a complex community, certainly you should be looking outside. We'll simply take the numbers they come up with instead of coming up with our own and integrate it into your super budget. And it's always good, just like we get a CPA audit every once in a while to oversee the association's books and make sure everything is good. Think about a outside reserve analysis in the same way. You're getting a verifying outside opinion that what has been put together in our super budget is reasonable. Well, let's now go ahead and talk about the concepts of funds. That's what makes a super budget interesting, is the funds. There are 4 specific funds, as you see. The first one is an operating fund. The purpose of an operating fund is for handling those fluctuations between what you thought was going to happen in your budget and what actually happened. Maybe you overran, maybe you underran. That's an operating fund. The second fund is called a replacement fund. The purpose of the replacement fund is to take care of all of the association's existing assets, their long-term repair and replacement. The third fund is a capital fund. The capital fund is for creating new assets in the community. And finally, we have something called a special purpose fund, which is, as it's described, those are funds collected for a particular special purpose. Let's go a little bit deeper on each of those. So let's start with the operating fund. Again, the operating fund is to take care of fluctuations or variations between what you budgeted and what actually occurred. An extreme example of this is way back in the 1980s. The 1980s, we had lots of problems with the economy, with people losing their jobs, and so associations' revenues dropped tremendously because people were either losing their homes or they weren't able to pay their assessments. At the same time, in the 1980s, we had double-digit inflation, where inflation was up to 14% at the worst part of that middle of the 1980s. And so we have revenues dropping by 10%, 20%. We have inflation going up by 10%, 14%. And normal assessment increases that are capped at 3%, 5%, 10% just couldn't keep up with that. So without an operating fund to absorb those fluctuations, associations would have had to make hard choices about turning off the streetlights, closing the pool, and a variety of things like that. So that's the purpose of the operating fund. We can estimate the ideal value or the target value for the operating fund based on the characteristics of the community. I won't go into those details much right now, but basically we're generally recommending that the operating fund be somewhere in the range of 25 to 75% of the normal operating expenses of the association. For most communities with a reasonable size and a certain amount of assets, recreational facilities, we're typically in the 40% range is what we're recommending. Let's now move over from the operating fund to the replacement fund. Again, the purpose of the replacement fund is to take care of the long-term repair and replacement of all of your existing assets. The assets being your playground equipment, your pool, your clubhouse, your gates, your private streets, your entry monuments, lighting, all of those things that you have and need to maintain long term. And so an example of that would be, let's say you have boulevard fences, and you paint those boulevard fences and keep them nice and fresh looking. And they need to be repainted, let's say, every 5 years, and it's going to cost you $20,000 to repaint that section of fence. Well, if you have to do it every 5 years, and it costs $20,000, then you would want to put aside $4,000 a year that you've collected from assessments, but let's put it aside into this replacement fund so that after 5 years, you have the $20,000 sitting there. You could pay it in cash and keep your fence maintained to the standards you want. The ideal or target value for the replacement fund is something that can be calculated through what's called a reserve analysis. The same thing an outside professional firm would do that we have built into our SuperBudget model. And so in a moment, we'll show you how the reserve analysis works in terms of its calculations. So we've talked about operating, replacement. Let's move on to the capital fund. Now, the purpose of the capital fund, again, is if you want to develop new assets for the community. Let's say you have a tract of land. You want to go ahead and put a playground on the land. You get some estimates. It's $40,000 to put the playground out there. You've set a goal. You want to get it done in 4 years because you have a newborn, and you want it to be available when they're 4 years old, so they can play with it. So if you had a $40,000 playground, the association wanted to put in, and you wanted to do it in 4 years, then you need to put aside $10,000 per year. At the end of 4 years, you can pay cash and have a brand new playground in the community. So that's the concept of a capital fund. But you may ask, well, why don't we get a loan? Certainly, some associations have the authority to get loans. And a loan is just a variation on the same capital fund. You can either accumulate money and then build, or you could get a loan, build now, and then pay off the loan plus interest. So all a loan does for a capital fund is it just changes the timing of when you actually do the project. If you have no land, if you have nothing you want to add, there is no reason to have a capital fund. So many associations, most associations, in fact, do not accumulate money into a capital fund. The last of the four are special purpose funds. And special purpose funds are exactly what the name implies. It's money that you're setting aside for a particular purpose. The purpose could be sound like an operating fund. So you could be putting money aside for, let's say the board decides, we need to get some security in the community. Security is normally an operating expense. But we don't have the funds to do it, but we have a security problem. Let's go ahead and ask the owners maybe to approve a special assessment to add security to the community until we can raise the assessments and support it that way. So that's kind of operating like. Or maybe we had not put money into our replacement fund to take care of the roads, or we don't have enough, and now we have a lot of potholes. And so we again maybe ask for a special assessment. The owners approve it so we can do a replacement project such as repairing the roads. Or we never had a capital project plan, we want to do it now, and people want to gate the community. So they vote for that, we collect the funds, and we do a capital project. So again, a special purpose fund is going to have a purpose like any of the others. The difference is the monies that are collected for a special purpose fund are collected with a promise. A promise that if you, the homeowners, give us, the association, the money, we promise we will use it in exactly the way we told you we would use it. So a special assessment is absolutely a special purpose fund because we put it on the ballot. We want this much money for this purpose. We must use it for that particular purpose. Well, now that we've talked about the four funds, operating, replacement, capital, and special purpose, let's look at how we calculate that ideal value, that target value that we need there. So on this next slide, we're going to look at the operating fund. And the operating fund, again, it's proportional to how much your normal operating expenses are. So in this example, we see a community that has $220,000 worth of revenues, $180,000 worth of expenses, and some net income. So in that example, what you see is that the ideal balance, if we've determined that we want a 30% coverage, I said normally 25 to 75 depending on the character of the community. If we want a 30% coverage, then 30% of $180,000 is $54,000. That right there is the ideal fund balance for the operating fund. I said on the replacement fund, the ideal value or the target value is calculated from a reserve analysis. So this next slide shows you what a reserve analysis looks like. And this is just a simple version of what's in the SuperBudget model and a simplified version of what you would pay an outside organization to create. I'm just going to go over the top line here, but what you do on a reserve analysis is you list all of your assets. This community has some pool plaster, a clubhouse roof, some fencing. Let's just concentrate on the pool plaster. What you do is on this analysis, you'd say, when was the last time this plaster was new? 2013. What's the useful life of this plaster? How long will plaster last? 8 years. So if it was new in 2013, it lasts 8 years. In 2021 is when we should expect we're going to have to replaster the pool. It costs today $24,000 to replaster the pool. So if you go through it, that means that we're kind of halfway through the life now. So it means we should have sitting in the bank $12,000. In addition, if we're going to reach our goal to have $24,000 after 8 years, in our next budget year, we need to set aside another $3,000. You do that for all your assets, and you come up with a bottom line. And these two numbers that you see circled right now are the key. So the accumulated balance, that's how much for all of our assets, whatever age they're at, that's how much we ought to have saved to make sure that we can take care of all of our assets when it's time to do their repair or replacement. So that's the $30,000 that you're seeing there. The number just to the right of that, that is that $11,000 is how much we need to set aside next year, in the next budget year, so that we are on target to be able to take care of all of our assets. So that's essentially what a reserve analysis is. It's a mathematical calculation based on the assets, the prices, and the age or the newness of what we have out there that we need to maintain. The next page is how we calculate the ideal target for a capital fund. This looks identical to the prior page because it is. In this particular case, we have a bunch of things we want to do. We want to put in another monument, install a jogging trail, some exercise stations, and maybe a pavilion. Those ideas have come up at various times. We decide we want them to happen at various times, and they cost so much. You do all that calculation, and you come up with the bottom line, the two numbers that are circled. And the first one, the $42,000, says if we have this much in the bank today, then we're on target to do all of these projects on the schedule we just mentioned. And then the number to the right of that is how much we need to set aside this year to stay on target. So those are the ideal balances we come up with through the SuperBudget model, and that's the key to the SuperBudget, is you're looking at the full financial picture and you're determining where our targets are, where we need to be what's referred to as fully funded. The end of that long SuperBudget package we put together has two wonderful graphs. So let's look at the first one. This first one is from one of our communities. And what you see on this graph are two lines. You have a red dotted line and you have a blue solid line. The red dotted line is the target. When you add up the sum of the operating fund, the replacement fund, the capital fund, and maybe a special purpose fund, that's how much you ought to have at any point in time. That vertical green line represents today. So everything to the left of today are the actual targets and actual balances we had. Everything to the right is our projections off into the future. Our SuperBudget typically goes to about 25 years off into the future because we do have assets like roads and things of that sort which have 20 to 30 year lives. So we need to go way out into the future to cover everything. And what you see from this graph, this particular one shows that the association has not really had their funds where they need to be. But as we move off into the future, those two lines come together. In other words, we've reached full funding, in this case, rather slowly over about a 7-year period. And you say, well, that's great. Let's do it. What's it going to cost us? Very important, you go to the second graph. The second graph shows you assessments. Again, we have two lines on here. We have a dotted line, which is simply representing inflation. We know prices go up, and so the question is, are our assessments going up faster or slower than you would expect just from inflation? To the left, we see the historical for this association. It's pretty much had assessments which have matched whatever inflation was. Moving to the right, remember on the prior graph, it was showing that we are going to get to full funding. This is showing us the assessments that get you to full funding. And you'll notice that we are having assessment changes, projecting assessment changes in the future that are less than the inflation rate. So that can give the board comfort that we're going to get to where we want to be, and it's not going to require excessive assessment changes or anything of that sort. So these two are two of the final exhibits of our SuperBudget, and it really tells the whole story. With these, you see the picture of the financial health of the association, and again, it allows us to do all of our responsibilities and any hopes and dreams we might have through our capital project plan. At the beginning, we posed two questions that every board member ought to feel comfortable answering relative to the finances of the association. Now that you've gone through the concepts of what's in a SuperBudget and how you calculate target and ideal levels for your funds, we can answer those with confidence. So on the first one, how much money should we have set aside in the bank? Well, we need $30,640 in our replacement fund, according to our reserve analysis, and we need to have $42,567 in our capital fund so we can do our 4 entry and park projects on schedule. And also we want to have $54,000 in our operating fund, which by board policy is set at 4 months operating expenses. Therefore, we should ideally have $127,000 in our fund balance. We currently have $105,000, so we're at 83% of our ideal target level. And the right assessment for our community, our assessment has been set at $460 to meet all of our operating, replacement, and capital goals, and to get us to our ideal funding level within 2 years. If you're able to answer questions with that specificity and that detail and that knowledge as to how to set those levels right, then you can answer them with confidence. Well, that covers the key concepts of what a SuperBudget is. I hope you've enjoyed what's here. It'll really help you as you're seeing the full 15, 16, 17 page SuperBudget we present to you and how everything interrelates. If you have any questions, certainly just let us know at C.I.A. Services. We're happy to let you to give you examples. And thank you for joining us. and for joining all of our C.I.A. Services Associations in Practice videos on YouTube. Thank you.